Welcome to the first topic of Module 3, an introduction to controlled substances. In this lecture, we will discuss the definition of an illicit drug. We will also discuss the history and the control of drugs, which will include defining the schedule of the various drugs combined under the Controlled Substances Act. We will then also identify and classify a lot of the common illicit drugs that are used in today's society. So exactly what is a drug? A drug is a natural or a synthetic substance that is designed to produce different effects in humans and in some cases animals. If we think of a drug with this broad definition, almost anything you touch could be considered a drug. So the real question is how strong of an effect or how soon does it produce that effect on individuals? Most often drugs are taken for intended uses, either obtained by prescriptions or over the counter, but at times they are also used for abuse and obtained illegally. Prescription drugs are manufactured under very strict quality control and are ordered by a physician. They are also received from a controlled source. Over-the-counter drugs are manufactured with little or no quality control, so they're available through multiple sources without regulation. There are also nutritional aids or dietary supplements. These will have little or no quality control, and in addition to that, have little or no basis in clinical trials for their actual effectiveness. Finally, there are illicit drugs, which are compounds produced or misused only for abuse. If we discuss the history of drug control in the United States, prior to the 1900s, there was little or no control. However, when public reaction to the smoking of opium by Chinese immigrants rose, and also there was a great rise in cocaine use, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was enacted. The main forces to get the bill passed were actively supported through the General Federation of Women's Clubs and the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Also, there were journalists reporting on the widespread use of drugs, and the Bureau of Chemistry in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This Food and Drug Act prohibits interstate commerce of mislabeled or adulterated food and drugs, and it was specifically designed to target marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and opium use. Publicly, cocaine and heroin were continually linked to crime. So in 1914, the Harrison Narcotic Act was introduced. This was administered by the IRS and was more or less a tax act. In 1930, the Bureau of Narcotics was developed, and it's an agency that was administered under the Treasury Department. So it stepped up a lot of the law enforcement against the illegal drugs. In 1951, the Boggs Act was introduced, which listed a lot of the prohibited substances. In 1956, the Narcotic Drug Control Act was introduced, and this gave a lot harsher penalties for the production and the possession of a lot of the various drugs. And finally, In 1970, the Comprehensive Controlled Substance Act was introduced. This is legal control for narcotics and dangerous drugs, not just the taxation. This placed drug control under federal jurisdiction, and the main enforcement agency was created under the Justice Department, the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA. It placed drugs into 5 distinct classes based on their use and the potential for abuse. These are the schedules according to the Act. The first schedule, Schedule 1 drugs, have a very high potential for abuse and have no currently accepted medical use. Schedule 2 drugs have a high potential for abuse, but do have some medical use. Schedule 3 drugs have less potential for abuse and a currently accepted medical use. Schedule 4 drugs have a low potential for abuse and have a current medical use. And Schedule 5 drugs show very low abuse potential but do have medical use. This chart gives you a good summary of the various schedules, their potential for abuse, the medical use, and also various examples of those drugs within that schedule. The Act also covered designer drugs and precursors. So it discussed the designer drugs being a substance that's chemically related to a controlled substance, or also precursors, which are the various components that are used in the illegal manufacture of drugs. Depending on the drug, the amount of the drug, the actual location where the drug is collected from, and the number of the offenses of the individual, there are different penalties for the various schedules of drugs. The illicit drugs can also be classified according to their origin. So depending on if it is a naturally occurring plant, a plant extract, a semi-synthetic drug, or a synthetic drug, these can also be classified into the various categories. However, in most instances, the drugs are going to be classified according to their actions. So we consider narcotics, hallucinogens, depressants, tranquilizers, and antipsychotics, stimulants, and steroids. If we initially discuss narcotics, do you wonder why Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz fell asleep in the field of flowers? This is because the flowers were poppies, and it is the resin from the poppies that produces opium, one of the main narcotics. Narcotics are going to relieve pain by depressing the nervous system, so it usually brings about sleep. There are either the opiates or synthetic opiates. The source and production of opiates begins with the field poppy itself. To obtain the drug, incisions are made in that seed capsule, which allows a white, milky sap to come out. Upon the exposure to air, that sap is going to turn more of a golden brown or brown color. And then this is going to be scraped off to yield the crude opium. So you can see crude opium can come in several different colors. And there's a lot of different sources for those poppy plants. Since prehistoric times, opium has been collected and used. But along the way, various forms of other drugs, taking into consideration isolation properties, have allowed for other drugs to be produced which are also considered in the same family. In 1804, morphine was isolated from the opium, and it has between 4 and 21% opium. In 1832, codeine was isolated from opium. It has 3% opium. It is commonly used in cough syrups. However, illicit use might be where addicts are using the cough syrups to ward off withdrawal symptoms. Heroin was synthesized from morphine in 1874 when they were trying to develop a less addictive form of morphine. This was done by reacting morphine with acetic anhydride, and it has purity levels that are 2 to 3 times more potent than morphine. Use of heroin causes the body to produce far less of the natural opioid peptides or endorphins, and this is what creates the dependence on morphine and also the severe withdrawal symptoms. Heroin can be classified into several different types, depending on the percent of heroin actually in the drug itself. And you can see various forms of heroin. Heroin's going to have a lot of short-term effects on the body, either on the central brain itself, your mouth, your skin, respiratory, and also muscular effects. There are also a lot of synthetic opiates that have been produced. They are going to have similar effects like opium. The most common of this is oxycodone or methadone. Oxycodone was synthesized from poppies in 1916. It is primarily used for chronic pain, but has become to be one of the more popular illicit drugs now used. It can be found under several different brand names, depending on if the drug itself is combined with acetaminophen or aspirin. In 1937, methadone was synthesized. This is primarily used by addicts as a substitute for heroin. And there are several other common synthetic opiates available. This is a short summary of the very common narcotics, showing their physical dependence and the psychological dependence ratings for the various drugs. If we move on to the hallucinogens, these are going to be drugs that cause alterations in mood, attitude, thought process, and perceptions. These drugs have no medical use. The common hallucinogens are cannabis, LSD, mushrooms, mescaline, ecstasy, and PCP. Cannabis was first introduced in the United States around 1920 by Mexican laborers and also American soldiers that brought it into the United States. It is probably the most widely used drugs, and now there have been several states that have approved it for medical use. Depending on the percent of THC in the drug itself, it might have several different names. Marijuana is going to cause several different behavioral effects: euphoria, relaxation, impaired learning, memory, and mood changes. And it's also going to have several different body effects. Cannabis can be found in the several different forms and several different percentages of drugs. There is the plant material. There's also the thick, sticky hashish that's made by collecting the resin from the tops of the plants, or hash oil that is made by taking the plant material and cooking it down with a solvent, and then removing the plant material so that only the oil remains. LSD is synthesized from a fungus. It is extremely potent and also has various behavioral effects. In addition to the behavioral effects, there's also going to be the bodily effects. LSD can be found in several different forms. It's commonly placed on blotter paper and also sometimes in candy. Mushrooms or psilocybin are also commonly found and abused. They're going to have various behavioral effects that last anywhere from 3 to 4 hours. Mescaline is found in a cactus, and usually this is sliced into wafers called buttons. It also has a lot of behavioral effects. And finally, PCP or phencyclidine was first marketed as a drug by Parke-Davis, and eventually it was taken off of the market because it was so widely abused. It was added and recrystallized onto marijuana. It has a lot of behavioral effects. Because it has been taken off of the market, you don't as commonly see PCP anymore. Ecstasy is a common drug. It's used in a lot of the club scenes. It will also have a lot of behavioral effects. So this chart summarizes a lot of the hallucinogens and once again gives you the degree of psychological dependence and physical dependence. Another category are your depressants, tranquilizers, and antipsychotics. These are primarily used to treat anxiety, tension, panic attacks, stress attacks, or sleep disorders. They are depressants that the drugs are used to slow or depress the central nervous system. Alcohol is actually a depressant, but it is not a controlled substance. The main depressants, tranquilizers, or antipsychotics are either your barbiturates or your benzodiazepines. There are approximately 25 different barbiturates, and they have several common names. The five most common barbiturates are listed on this slide. And they vary slightly in the chemical makeup so that it allows the drugs to produce varying effects, whether or not they're fast effects or slow or intermediate reacting drugs. These are not as commonly abused as they were at one time. Methaqualone was primarily used in the 1970s to replace your barbiturates used for insomnia. These were highly abused, so they have been removed from the market. Benzodiazepines can be classified either as short or long-acting drugs, and there are various drugs under each of those categories. They are used primarily for sedation, for anxiety treatments, and are typically used in a critical care setting. There are also a lot of the long-acting benzodiazepines. Alprazolam or Xanax is the most prescribed and most misused of the benzodiazepines. But there are also several other abused benzodiazepines. This is a summary of the various depressants, tranquilizers, and antipsychotics. Barbiturates are listed twice on this chart. The first one with the S after it are your more slow-acting barbiturates. The long-acting barbiturates will have a lower psychological dependence. There are also club drugs, or what is considered your date rape drugs, GHB, Rohypnol, and ketamine. And then another classification, your stimulant drugs. These are going to induce temporary improvements in either mental or physical functions, or in some instances, both. When the effects of these wear off, a lot of times the person is considered to have crashed, that they actually revert back to a lower than normal energy level. Amphetamines were first synthesized in 1887, and there were several chemical compounds that were produced at that time. They are used for the treatment of attention deficit disorder, appetite suppressants, asthma, depression. But they also have their illicit use. This is a list of some of your common amphetamines. Methamphetamine was first synthesized in 1893, and then crystallized meth came about in 1919. Crystallized meth or methamphetamine are both more potent than amphetamine, and it leads to very strong dependency. This shows some of the adverse effects of the use of methamphetamine. And as you can see from this slide, when a person uses methamphetamine for numerous years, it has great effects on their body. Methamphetamine has become one of the more abused drugs, and part of this is because it can be more simply made, and a lot of meth labs are now found and have to be investigated. Usually with the meth lab, there's going to be an unusual, strong, or sweet odor because of the different chemical components that are used in the production of meth. A lot of times the residences will have blacked out windows, and some of those windows may have fans in the windows to withdraw the odors from the interior. Cocaine is also a stimulant. It is a naturally occurring substance found in the cocoa plant. The original formula for Coca-Cola contained cocaine, but it was changed to caffeine in 1903. Cocaine is extremely addictive. The effects of it are very short-lived. They usually only last about 30 minutes, and the drug itself can be found in several different forms. This is a short overview showing the various common stimulants, their physical dependence, and also the psychological dependence. And the final category are your anabolic steroids. These have become to be greatly abused also. They are going to be synthetic compounds that are chemically related to the male sex hormone, testosterone. They also have effects on the body and also behavioral effects. Now that we know a little bit about the various controlled substances and the drugs that are abused, we'll discuss the actual examination of the solid dosage drugs and also toxicology samples for these drugs.